I now want to invite Helmut Loewen. Now, we've known him for some time by living in the same city. His reputation is justly deserved as a long-standing anti-fascist activist. And what I'd like to do is to make sure that we give a big welcome to Harry and allow him all the time. And I can see all the participants who are with us at the beginning are still here at the end. And I very much hope we'll give Harry every chance to give us his message. So thank you, Helmut-Harry Loewen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you to the panelists for their very incisive and inspiring analyses. Everyone on this panel means a great deal to me personally, and also politically and philosophically. I cannot stress that enough. I'm grateful that I'm able to speak here from the studio of Yaron Walter, who is my longtime comrade of over 30 years in anti-fascist projects. I also want to thank Paul Graham and Brendan Devlin for their organizational work. Now, I had already finished my presentation when Brendan, after I asked him, sent me his brilliant MA thesis, supervised by Dr. Desai, which deals with 21st century Canadian imperialism. And I urge everyone to get a copy of that from Brendan Devlin. And he wrote to me sharing the following, which I thought I would include as at the outset of my presentation here. He said that he first became aware of anti-fascism in 2017 during the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he paid close attention to the anti-fascist tactics that were deployed there. And as Brendan writes, quote, as much as I appreciated the militancy and impact of those tactics, I was always taken aback by the sort of normative anarchism that framed a lot of anti-fascist analysis and praxis. That's a very insightful point. And it's borne out by, for example, what happened in Leipzig, Germany, just a few days ago on Tuesday. An Antifa, an anti-fascist group in Leipzig, part of the so-called autonomous anti-authoritarian scene in that city, smashed the windows of an immigrant political organizing space. This left-wing space was run by Black immigrants and people of color, and they smashed the windows and, quote, and threw bottles or glass jars of pig fat into the building. And they bragged about this on Indie Media, an anarchist platform, and basically said, we're doing this because you are importing anti-Semitism to Germany. And a few days later, a so-called feminist Antifa group in Leipzig made the same point. The group is called Fantifa, and it warned the left in Germany not to express solidarity with Palestinian people, and especially Muslims in Germany. So that is one example of a number of examples which we can use. I refer secondly here to what happened just a few months ago in Berlin, when the headquarters of the Marxist newspaper, Junge Welt, Germany's longest standing daily Marxist newspaper founded in 1947, was picketed by anarchists and anti-fascists holding up the Rojava Antifa flag, and they were protesting one of the journalists for Junge Welt, Susanne Witt-Stahl, who has for at least 12 years documented extensively fascism in Ukraine and the problem with the anti-fascist movement in Germany, which she argues rightly has abandoned its revolutionary traditions and has become a kind of force for neoliberalism. And she documents and argues this extensively. And there are reasons how this occurred. In the late 1990s, for example, the coalition German government of the Social Democrats and the Green Party, for the first time, adopted a kind of a two-tier strategy. They sent troops, for the first time, German troops, into foreign battle since the Second World War. And secondly, the Social Democrats and Greens set up what is called in Germany a Staatsantifa, a state-sponsored antifascism. These were strategies meant to defang and neutralize and debilitate the left. This is a process that's ongoing with some of the more recent programs by the Social Democrats, by the Interior Minister, Nancy Faeser, under her extremism outreach, which tends to conflate so-called left-wing extremism and right-wing extremism. It's a war on the left under the pretext of fighting so-called right-wing extremism. So in one of her books a decade ago, Wittstow published a collection which carries a very strange title. Antifa heißt Luftangriff. Antifa means air raid. And what that refers to, that odd title, is that among Greens, Social Democrats, and the peace movement in the 1990s, with the war on Serbia, the NATO war, anti-fascism was now defined as supporting NATO bombing raids to dislodge, quote, the Hitler of the Balkans, namely Slobodan Milosevic. So Wittstow is very good in terms of tracing the degeneration, the decomposition of the German left and the German anti-fascist movement, and raises some very difficult questions. On the cultural front, she also showed, for example, and this is quite the obscenity, earlier this year was the 125th anniversary of the birthday of Bertolt Brecht. And who was invited in Brecht's birthplace in Augsburg and at Brecht's theater in Berlin to commemorate these events, but a fascist ensemble called the Dak Daughters, who described themselves as the daughters of Bandera, and who first came into public prominence during the Maidan fascist coup. They are described by one journalist in Germany as the pinup girls for Ukrainian fascism. And so you have fascists, 7 women who sort of express a kind of avant-garde of fascism in the cultural sphere. So you have the cultural bourgeoisie, which is predominantly left-wing in Augsburg and Berlin, bringing in fascists to commemorate Bertolt Brecht. It boggles the mind. Philosophically, we can also track some of the developments in academia and in philosophical discourse, which, as Radhika pointed out with her excoriation of Alberto Toscano, there are a number of philosophers that we can mention here very briefly. In 1977, for example, Michel Foucault publishes a famous preface to a book by Deleuze and Guattari, in which he talks about the non-fascist life, not the anti-fascist life. He says anti-fascism is easy. What's difficult is to cultivate a non-fascist life. And he then talks about the fascist inside all of us, the fascist in our head, the fascist who loves power. Now, as absurd as this sounds to us who come at fascism from a perspective of historical materialism, this is a prominent thesis which has variations in academia and in the activist world. Right? For example, Brad Evans, the philosopher of nonviolence, in his book on Deleuze and fascism, Evans says, before we can start our analysis of fascism, we have to realize that we are all fascists. So the point is we have to extricate the fascist in us. More recently, Jack Bratich, a professor at Rutgers, has published a very popular book called On Microfascism. This is the concept du jour since Foucault and Guattari, microfascism. And he says in this book that the question is not class analysis. What is primordial are patriarchal systems of oppression, right? So feminist and gender analysis, not class analysis. The most odious example of this trend is even more recent. The philosopher Rosi Braidotti, who recently retired from Utrecht, she was giving a seminar recently at the European University in Florence, at the Max Weber seminar, to predominantly postdoctoral students. And this is how Braidotti puts it. She says, for example, that we need to abandon class analysis and the whole tradition of Hegelian negativity. She is proposing a kind of neo-Spinozism, which you also find in Deleuze and Guattari. And she argues, for example, and I'll just make a few quotes here. She says her position is a post-human feminism. She's also associated with the so-called new materialism, which we can talk about at another point. She says that Guattari and Deleuze's book, A Thousand Plateaus, is the philosophical work of the past half century. And this is how she puts it. We need to develop an anti-fascist philosophy, which is, quote, an antidote to the poison of fascism. She says such a philosophy has immunological effects, parasitological effects. Such a philosophy serves us as a detox. She says, we need to recognize the micro-fascist inside of us, quote, that which lulls us to sleep for the fascination of fascism. She says we need to suspend any talk about actually existing fascism and deal first and foremost with our internal fascism. She then concludes, and it's rather arrogant. She says, my position is a radical position, as if the Marxist and the class-based positions are something else. She says, this is a radical position, but then, and I couldn't make this up, twice she advises her postdoctoral students, but you should be very careful when you address this topic until you get tenure. That is how academic opportunists are made by that sort of advice. Rosi Braidotti. So with the focus on the care of the self, to use Foucault's language, these theories, which have their ascendancy under neoliberalism and continue to this day, are one example of how anti-fascism has been removed from what Wittstahl calls its Marxist roots. It's been removed from what Bertolt Brecht advised would be an analysis of fascism, which recognizes that fascism is the most brutal, treacherous form of capitalism. There are other theorists, Roger Griffin, the historian, Jason Stanley, right? Jason Stanley gave a series of lectures in early August at the Kiev School of Economics. They are online. I recommend that you watch these for the completely specious approach that Stanley takes to the question of fascism. And it's also quite embarrassing and even cringeworthy when you watch these lectures. There are others. We can look also at the way in which hate crime studies in academia are complicit in distorting our view of fascism. And I'll mention only here a leading scholar from my discipline in criminology and sociology. Dr. Barbara Perry is perhaps Canada's leading scholar of hate crime. In recognition of her service to the security state, Perry was recently given the UNESCO chair in hate studies at Ontario Tech University. Now, we can say a lot about Barbara Perry. She comes across as progressive, but she's very critical of anti-fascist movements, uses models of extremism to equate the left and the right. And she said in one interview on CBC a few years ago, after an altercation involving Montreal Antifa, les antifascistes in Montreal, she was critical and said, they give us all a bad name, us progressives. She said, they don't represent, quote, the Canadian values we hold dear. Remember, this is an academic talking now. Canadian values we hold dear. She says, extremism is extremism. It's the polar opposite of what characterizes the rest of us. She then agreed with CBC host Michael Serapio when Serapio said in conclusion, quote, the anti-fascist movement discredits progressives just as the alt-right damages conservatives or those who identify as conservative. I can't get into, for reasons of time, the role of foundations and think tanks. But I mentioned here the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is the example, a good example of kind of an astroturfed organization that was imposed on the activist community. But recently, in late November, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network co-sponsored what was billed an anti-fascist event with the German embassy and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, a social democratic foundation. And at that event, it featured a number of speakers, really no activists, but one of the speakers was Stephanie Carvin, who's a professor in international studies at Carleton. She is widely seen on television talking about security matters. She was described by a military journalist as a cheerleader for CSIS, a cheerleader for the security establishment. Carvin also engages in this type of, equivalency between the left and the right. But just as a footnote before I go on to my very last point, do a Google search on Stephanie Carvin and the word cakes that are baked. She was caught in a scandal when it was discovered that she had a habit of baking cakes which featured drones blasting so-called Muslim terrorists, right? These were cakes. Now, Stephanie Carvin, before she became a professor, was a consultant to the Department of Defense in the United States on drone warfare. So here she is spreading a kind of Islamophobia by making fun of and giving her friends in academia and in the spy business elaborately decorated cakes, birthday cakes, and cupcakes featuring these symbols. It boggles the mind. Now, in conclusion, Alan, I cannot thank you enough both for your introductory comments and for the comments prefacing my talk. You mentioned Canadian fascism on the home front. And let me conclude here with the following. It's been a scant 5 weeks since Canadian parliamentarians gave standing ovations to a fascist. It strains credulity to accept what many of the politicians claimed, namely that they knew not who Mr. Honka was. That's nonsense. And I'll give two examples. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, a member of parliament for Toronto, and another backbencher from Toronto, Yvonne Baker, are both prominent in terms of activism in the Ukrainian Canadian Congress chapter in Toronto. Freeland knows exactly who Honka was. And this might explain why she was so nervous as questions were raised in the House subsequently about who Honka was. Yvonne Baker, a literal backbencher, was moved to the front bench and had the most prominent seat during Zelensky's speech and is prominently shown cheering on Honka in the loge. Baker knew exactly who Honka was. Yvonne Baker was on the UCC executive when that organization sponsored 3 commemoration events, 2007, 2012, and 2021, honoring this very division. And Honka was around then. He didn't move to North Bay until later. So we need to learn a lot more, and I can only echo Alan's point about putting pressure before this event goes down the memory hole even further. So to conclude, right, in the House of Commons, we often heard the Ukrainian phrase, glory to Ukraine, glory to our heroes in Ukrainian, Slava Ukraini, right? This incantation. Against that obscenity of glorifying Ukraine, against the historical falsifications that are part of any heroization and glorification of Ukrainian fascism, against Holocaust denial, against the rehabilitation of Nazis and their whitewashing of their crimes, now and then, we anti-fascists all invoke a different tradition. We invoke the call, the imperative of the anti-fascist partisans during the Second World War. We invoke the phrase smert fascismu, death to fascism, glory and freedom to the people. Smert fascismu, not slava Ukraini. It was Stepan Filipovich, the courageous communist partisan in Yugoslavia, who at the moment of his execution, when the Nazis had put the noose around his neck, you have this famous picture of him holding up both hands and crying out, "To the ages, death to fascism." This is our call. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.